Well, today is Columbia Sunday, and this is something that we get to be thankful for in His faithfulness. I thought it would be good to give all of you, because there's some of you who don't really know the full story of how Columbia became our missions focus. For some of you who are newer to our church, you might be wondering, why Columbia? Like, why did we pick that place? What's the connection there? And so I just want to kind of give you a rundown, a history of the mission of this church, the missions focus of this church, from the point at which I arrived in 2007. I'll do this as succinctly as possible because I got something to preach as well. So starting in 2007, we were just trying to keep our heads above water. 80% of the church had exited within the first 8 months of our arrival here, which is awesome boost to your ego, let me tell you. It was actually probably exactly what I needed at that season of my life, where pride and things were a part of my life, and not that they're completely gone, but God's certainly worked through that. And so 80% of the church had left. The church had a missions focus at that point when I arrived, and it was in the area of Papua New Guinea. And the church had sent teams to Papua New Guinea, which, if you don't know where that is, it's on the other side of the world. It's just north of Australia. It's about 14 hours into the future today. So their focus was Papua New Guinea, and they had done some construction projects there, and it was really, when we arrived, something that Mark and Monica DeRazio wanted me to experience and see. And so it was in 2008 that I got to go to Papua New Guinea with Mark. And it was for the dedication of a building, a housing project that they had built, that the church had built, along with Mark and other people in the church, and they were going to it was finally coming to completion, and they were dedicating that building. I believe that building's still there. They did a good job. It's still standing. And that building, most of you would not know this, and they would probably not want me to tell you this because it's just who they are, but the name of the building is actually called the DeRazio House. And yeah, it's pretty awesome, honestly. And so I went and visited, and when we returned, I felt strongly that as the leader of the church, that we needed some place that was going to be a little bit more accessible, if I'm being honest. That to be able to take teams all the way to Papua New Guinea just wasn't very realistic on a consistent basis, on an ongoing basis. And so I also felt like the dedication of that facility and stuff was a little bit of a conclusion to that season of the church. And however, there is still ministry going on. There's still an impact that's going on, not just in Papua New Guinea, but in the South Pacific. And Mark and Monica still have that as a missions passion and focus for that part of the country. And we celebrate that, and we're excited about that. But I just felt for us as a church, as the body of the church, that we needed someplace closer that we could easily access. And I figured, since we were in San Antonio, where it's 60% Hispanic, that maybe we should be in a Spanish-speaking country. And so I went in 2010. I went on a scouting trip to Chile and to Peru with a mentor of mine. And we went down. We fell in love with the people of Chile. I didn't love the country of Peru, if I'm being honest, and we fell in love with the people of Chile. Our church helped with a completion of a remodel and expansion and addition of a Foursquare church all the way at the southern part of Chile, and it's also really, really cold down there. And we kind of finished that project, but it was too far to get all the way down there to be our missions focus. In 2011, I met on one previous occasion, I met Juan Allen actually at Mark and Monica DeRazio's house over a dinner. And then later on in 2011, I met with him at a restaurant with the introduction from Carlos and Maria Inez Garzon, who head up our Spanish translation ministry here, and have planted a church out of this church years ago called Roca Viva, and now they're back here. And they introduced me to Juan Allen. And Juan Allen was heading up MMI Amazon, MMI Colombia. And I was 4 years at that point into my ministry here at Lifehouse. And to be honest, I was kind of getting to a place where I wasn't sure, there was a lot of change, a lot of transition. I wasn't like, God, is this really what you want me to do? And he was at a place as well, sitting there at dinner, unbeknownst to me, that he was like, I don't know what the future of my ministry looks like. And so you have two very broken people, very burned out people, kind of trying to console one another in the midst of our ministry angst and frustrations. And in that moment, a bond was formed based upon the fact that he was a pastor's kid, I was a pastor's kid. Here we are in ministry. We're both feeling some of the same things. And so something happened in that moment where now all of a sudden there was like this mutual relationship and friendship that then knitted our heart with MMI Colombia, what is now MMI Amazon. In 2014, previously to that, we had sent some construction projects down to the Amazon. I went down to the Amazon. No joke, I spent 3 nights in a tent in the Amazon. And I will never do it again. I'm going down to the Amazon tomorrow, Tuesday technically, and I'm not staying in a tent in the village. I'm staying in an eco-lodge, which is a little bit glorified camping in the Amazon, and hoping that I find the anti-venom to whatever bit me across the world. So I figured, I don't know. We sent some construction projects down there, and our continued relationship was going. They were doing iProjects. We were helping fund iProjects through our Make a Difference offering. And in 2014, Jeremy Pummel joined our staff as an assistant pastor and as missions pastor. And Jeremy was also involved with something called Compassion International. That's a child sponsorship program. And I had always felt like there was this missing component with our relationship with MMI Colombia and that aspect, in that there wasn't any sort of church or Foursquare connection. And so Jeremy comes onto our staff. He's doing a compassion project, like a recruiting project, so he invites pastors to come down to, guess where? Colombia, of all places. This was prearranged a year before we ever brought him on our staff. We didn't know that. And so he takes us down. He takes my father and I down to Colombia, to a place called Cienega de Oro, and we found the missing piece to our missions focus, which was the Foursquare Church was functioning with compassion projects in their church. And so what happened was they wanted to expand to another compassion project and build a church plant. And so we came home in Lifehouse with 4 to 5 other churches, put together the funds, and we raised $70,000 to build another church down the road that would also house a compassion project. We also got first rights to sponsor kids in that compassion project, and we did. We have over 100 kids that are sponsored from our church in that project. And so we've then been able to go and minister and visit and be in the homes of the kids that we sponsor. And before you think that this is going to be a big push for child sponsorship, it's not. Okay, so everybody just take a deep breath and relax. I don't like when people do, like I go to a concert and then in the middle of the concert, it's like this big guilt trip about sponsoring kids. I don't like that. I'm there for the concert. So this is not that. Just relax, everybody. But if you do want to sponsor a kid and have the opportunity to go visit your kid at some point, we can help you with that, and we're happy that you can contact Kevin at Lifehouse SA. He'll get you connected, and we'll get you child sponsorship opportunities there. So what then took place, now we have MMI Amazon, which is all the medical side of things, and then we've got our child sponsorship and the local church, and we help raise funds for roofs on church plants, and we built church plants, and we helped build bathrooms, and now we've got this program going. And by the way, I don't know if you've seen the movie Sound of Freedom yet, but I haven't seen it. I've heard, though, that they mention Colombia quite a bit in there. And I just want to encourage you that part of what you're doing in child sponsorship is eliminating the ability for child sex trafficking, for the ability for sex work, for things like that, that actually makes a difference in that context. So I just want to encourage you that I know they just raised their rates to like $43 a month, I think, or something like that, right? 40-something. And from 35 or 7 or 37, and so you're like, oh man, this is too much. It's going to cost you like another latte per month. So just keep that in perspective. But so that was taking place. Well, so now we had this and we had this. Well, then all of a sudden this beautiful thing began to take place where we, MMI Amazon, with Juan Allen's help, put on an eye project in Cienega de Oro where all of our kids, all of their parents, all of their grandparents could get eye care. And we could go down and we could serve those people as well as visit our kids. And there was this conversion of the ministry and the Foursquare ministry that was taking place with the medical ministry of MMI Amazon. And now all of a sudden it was this perfect, beautiful picture. Fast forward a few years, Jeremy left our staff to be on staff at a church in Portland, Oregon. Pastor Jay came onto our staff in a full-time role as an assisting pastor and missions pastor. And through a conversation that Pastor Jay and Juan Allen had about this dream that Juan Allen always had of a hospital boat, Pastor Jay said, okay, let's go down that road. And so we had someone in our church offer up matching funds for that. And so at our Make a Difference offering in 2021, we presented a huge vision for you. And we didn't know if we could get to the 50,000. We had never hit the 50,000 mark in our Make a Difference offering before. And not only did we hit it, but we went above that. We raised 100,000 plus the 50,000. So we were at 150,000, and then there was another church up in Washington that contributed. All being said, by the end of the year, Lifehouse, with the help of others, had raised just under 200,000. Later on, that flipped and that started to snowball, and they raised over almost $1 million. I think maybe they're just over $1 million now. That boat is being built. I was supposed to be at the dedication this Tuesday. But because of a lot of challenges and unforeseen situations, we're now pushing the dedication to October. And so the plan now is for that to take place in October. But it's moving forward. We could be praying for some rain because they need some rain to come up and pull the boat into the river. So you can, we need rain here, they need rain there. Let's just pray for rain. I think that's an old Christian band too. So, all that being said, this is why Colombia. This is why we're a part of Colombia. It all began with a dinner with two broken people whose God knit our hearts together for the future of what He wanted to do. And I want to just, if I can, just tell you, all of what I just shared has nothing to do with me. And it has nothing to do with Juan Allen. And it has nothing to do with Pastor Jay or Pastor Jeremy before it. It has to do with the obedience of listening to the heart of God and walking through whatever door He opens up. That's what it's about. And so when we talk about great is His faithfulness, we can look at that story and say, God, great is your faithfulness. It is because of your grace and your favor upon Lifehouse Church, on MMI Amazon, on Cienega de Oro. Like, you have a plan and a purpose, and we just are lucky enough to go along for the ride. And so I just want to encourage you that as a church, we've just done, you've been so generous and so gracious towards giving to our missions effort. And I would just say today, let's celebrate that. At the end, we're going to have an opportunity to have some food together. We're going to have some Colombian food, some empanadas and different things. And we're going to just have a party and all of that. But I just want you to celebrate the fact that God has been faithful in this effort. And honestly, it's probably, when I look at the life of my ministry, it's the one thing that I just take a step back and I'm like, I can put a message together, I can preach, I can counsel people and stuff, and some of that stuff I can even do in my own ability. But there is no way in God's green earth that from 2011 till now, 12 years ago, I could have ever imagined that God would have done what he's done. And yet we just get to look at it in awe and say, thank you for your faithfulness. So, all right. Somehow I got to preach a message real quick. All right. Acts chapter 15. We talked about this problem that the church had. These leaders came in, said, you guys have to follow these rules. And then Paul and Barnabas, they go to Jerusalem, they have this council, and they say, no, we don't have to follow these rules. Not for salvation, but we need to be mindful of other believers. But I want us to pick up later on in that chapter in verse 36, which is really one of the most probably underpreached. Last week's was probably the most underpreached. But this isn't a topic that often gets addressed in the church because it deals with conflict. And the majority of people, there's a small group of people that actually like conflict. And they're sick individuals. They actually enjoy it. But most people do not like conflict. And so most people don't really enjoy this story. But I want us to take a look at it. This is about two other human beings called by God to do the work of the ministry, and all of a sudden, they find themselves in this disagreement. Luckily, Juan Allen and I have never come to a place of disagreement. We've always been in unity towards the ministry and the focus, and keeping the focus on God and not on the church or the ministry. So we've not really had any disagreements. I mean, there's some theological things that he might think differently than me or I do, but they're not salvation issues, and so we can agree to disagree. But in this case, they came to a head where the disagreement was too much to overcome. So we find ourselves in Acts chapter 15, verse 36 through 41. It says, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, John Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So just because we are believers doesn't mean that we are going to agree on everything. The church, the early church, had just avoided a church split over this secondary issue, right? The Jerusalem council met, they figured it out, they talked it through, and they avoided this massive division, this massive church split. But now you have two of the most notable people in the early church, in Paul and Barnabas, and now they're at odds with one another. And the whole church is looking on to see how this is all going to pan out. Now, I appreciate Luke including this story because I think we, if we're not careful, have times where, or tendencies to put people that we read about in Scripture on pedestals. So you've got Paul, you got Barnabas, and these seemingly amazing men who are going around planting all these churches, leading churches, expanding the kingdom, and it would be easy for us to put them on a pedestal. And yet what this story shows us and what Luke describes for us is they were just people like us. They were real people with real emotions, real strengths, real weaknesses. These were people like you and me. And I find great encouragement in that. Because at times I'll read the books that Paul wrote and the letters to the churches and how he navigated and handled things. And I'm like, I could never amount to that or be like Paul. But then I read a story like this where Paul and Barnabas, they can't even get their stuff together. They can't even work out their problems. And I'm like, that I can amount to. I can identify with that. So I'm going to remind us of how we got here with these two gentlemen, and maybe for you this morning, you're going to decide which team you're on. So first, in this corner over here, we've got Team Barnabas, right? This is conflict. This is a fight, by the way. So we got Team Barnabas. Team Barnabas, he hails from the tribe of Levites. These are the priestly tribes. These are the Levites were there to assist the priests. He grew up in Cyprus. He comes to Jerusalem. He hears about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and so he runs to that place, and he sees the Holy Spirit move and work, and he decides he's going to stay in Jerusalem, and he's going to be a part of the early church. We find that on Team Barnabas, Barnabas was very generous. In Acts chapter 4, he sells a piece of property that he has and he donates it to the church so that they could take care of and feed the poor. He was also called the son of encouragement. He was known as an encourager. He knows how to lift a room. Barnabas is a guy whose name was really Joseph, but he was such an encourager and such a good guy that they're like, we got to change your name. So they changed his name to Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. One could argue that Barnabas was really people-focused. He cared about the people. He encouraged the people. He loved the people. When the church was planted and there was some problems up there, who did the Jerusalem church trust? They trusted Barnabas to go up there and take care of things. In Acts chapter 11, verse 22, it says, news of this reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived and saw the evidence of the grace of God, what did he do? He was glad. He was a happy guy. He was a nice guy. He was glad, and he encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. This was a happy person. This was a person who looked for every opportunity to encourage other people. How many of you this morning are on Team Barnabas? You're like, I like that guy. Anybody? Just like raise your hands. I like Barnabas. He seems like a nice guy. Barnabas was a second chance guy, right? Part of the reason Paul was even a part of the church was because, remember, everybody was afraid of Paul, and Barnabas went and visited with him and realized this guy had changed. He had matured. There were some things that were different about him, and so he comes back to the disciples, and he vouches for him, and he's like, listen, Paul's a different guy. We need to include him, and Paul was a part of the church. Why? Because Barnabas is a second chance guy. How many of you like a second chance? I like second chances in my life. I thank God for second chances and third chances and fourth chances. And Barnabas was that guy. Now, being a second chance guy, how many of you are in Team Barnabas? I'm a Team Barnabas guy. Over in this corner, yep, Team Paul. Paul is this well-educated, he studied under the top scholars, and it turns out Paul is super competitive. Philippians chapter 3, verse 4 through 6 says, if anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, guess what? I got more. circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, I'm faultless. I got this. I'm better than you at this. And you say, well, that was, before he became a Christian. It was before his conversion experience. Well, even in his letter to Corinth, he says something about a race, doesn't he? He says, well, if you are running the race, then run the race in such a way as to what? Win. Of course Paul said that. Paul's like, I'm not going to run the race to lose. I'm going to run the race to win. And probably at this point, Team Barnabas is looking over to the corner of Team Paul and thinking, I think he's going to take me. Like, he's mean. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, and he was so adamant that the Gentiles understand the gospel of Jesus that the Jews ultimately wanted to kill him. Let me give you some examples. Acts chapter 9. Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Christ. After many days had gone by, the Jews conspired to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night, lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall. Paul ticks people off so much that he's got to be lowered down in a basket. Verse 26, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas, Team Barnabas, nice guy Barnabas, took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had been seen by the Lord, or seen the Lord, and the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. And in verse 28 it says, so Saul stayed with them and moved freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He talked and debated with the Grecian Jews, but guess what? They tried to kill him. I think it's worth noting that they aren't trying to kill Peter and James and John or my friend Barnabas over here. They're trying to kill Paul. There was something about Paul that drove these people nuts. When the brothers learned of this, that he was making everybody mad, they took him down to Caesarea and they sent him off to Tarsus. And I think it's no coincidence in verse 30 it says, then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. Paul's a troublemaker. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit. The church grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord. Coincidence that mean Paul was gone? I don't know. 10 years goes by, and the church has now been started in Antioch. And in chapter 11, it says, then Barnabas went to Tarsus, because he knew that the church needed teaching, and he knew that the smartest guy that he knew was Paul, and Paul wasn't that far away. And so he went and looked for Paul, and he found him, and he brought him to Antioch. And so for a whole year, Barnabas and Paul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. If you find yourself not liking Paul's position, I think it's important to note that he did initiate this second journey, right? So how many of you now are like, I'm Team Paul? There's like 4 of you that are like, I see his point. I actually like Paul, and you probably like conflict as well, but I'm actually Team Barnabas and Team Paul. I like them both, which makes me Switzerland, I think. But if you find Paul's position in this, kind of a problem, this is important to understand. Paul's like, I'm the one coming to you, Barnabas, and saying, I think we should go encourage these people. Let's go do this. So I'm planning the trip. I get to decide where we go. I get to decide who gets to go. I just recently came back from a trip with my family. My father and my mother, it was their 55th anniversary. It was my son and my new daughter-in-law. they're just celebrating being together. And he was celebrating that she said yes. And we were celebrating our 25th anniversary. But guess who planned the trip? I did. So I'm planning the trip. We go where I want to go, and we also go with the people who I want to go with. In this case, it was them, until we got on the trip. And then I wasn't sure that it wanted to be them, but that's a different story for a different time. That's just called traveling with family. Paul's saying, I'm the one that's planning the trip. And also, to be fair to Paul in this corner, John Mark deserted them once before. They were out doing the ministry, they were planting churches. John Mark gets up in the middle of the night without even telling them, and he just leaves. He leaves. In chapter 13, verse 13, it says, from Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga and Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. We could argue that, like Barnabas being people-focused, Paul was mission-focused. He was so laser-focused on the mission and the expansion of the kingdom and the expansion of the church that sometimes people got in the way. Galatians 5:2 says this, mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. Just a small little statement there. He says, you have fallen away from grace. Here's the picture of what's taking place. Peter's in Antioch, and Peter is not following the ceremonial laws. And then all of a sudden, some Jews from Jerusalem come to Antioch, and now all of a sudden, Peter starts following the ceremonial laws. And Paul is ticked about it because it's hypocrisy. He's like, you weren't doing it, but now you're just trying to impress these people. And so now these leaders are there, and he's all of a sudden starting to follow these laws, and Paul is furious. And it says in chapter 2 of Galatians, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Paul wasn't exactly the kind of guy that we learn about in Mary Poppins, where a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Paul just shoves it down your throat. He says, you were clearly in the wrong, and before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. That's an interesting point there. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then you force the Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So now how many of you are on Team Paul? We're like, yes, justice. Like they're going against the gospel of Jesus Christ and Jesus being by grace through faith, not of works. And we're like, Paul, yes, I'm on Paul's team. Peter now is a bit embarrassed. Barnabas is embarrassed. And ultimately, it's what led to the Jerusalem Council that we talked about last week. But if I'm Barnabas, I'm thinking, listen, Paul, I stood up for you. I gave you a second chance. I came, I saw that you had a conversion experience. I vouched for you to the other disciples. Could you just tone it down a little bit? You don't have to be so mean about it. I care about these people. And Barnabas did. He cared about the people, and he's like, listen, there's a way to speak the truth, but to speak the truth in love. I don't know what Paul would have said to that, but that's what I would have said to Paul. You have two completely different people, two completely different personalities that are now faced with a decision that causes this disagreement. We pick it up in verse 36 of chapter 15. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back, visit the brothers in the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. And now, maybe Paul's learned his lesson a little bit. He's toned it down a little bit. And he says to Barnabas, I don't think that's wise. I don't think it's wise to take him. Because he had deserted us. And the word deserted there is apostanta, which means apostatize. It means unfaithful. John Mark was unfaithful to the mission in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in work. Barnabas' argument, though, is that, well, wait a minute, Paul. He's changed. I know he abandoned us. I know he had made this mistake, but he's matured. He's changed. I kind of vaguely remember somebody else changing. Like, do we not give him the second chance that maybe you were given? Verse 39, they had such a sharp disagreement, and the word disagreement there is paroxysmos, I don't know. Paroxysm outburst. I don't think that's right, but it's something along those lines. And they parted company. The church of Antioch is watching this rumble go down, right? This fight that's taking place. And they're thinking to themselves, wait a minute, I like Barnabas. Barnabas is a nice guy. He has encouraged me a lot. I like that guy. I think we should probably give John Mark a second chance because I remember Paul getting a second chance. So I think I'm on Team Barnabas. But then the other side of the church is like, well, wait a minute. John Mark screwed up. He left. He abandoned. And we can't have somebody who's just going to abandon us again. We need team players. We need somebody who's going to stick it out even through the difficult times. And I come to you this morning and I say, sometimes you can have two positions that are right, but they aren't going to move forward together. And this is important for us to learn because there are times where you have people who you disagree with, and you have people who see things differently than you. And sometimes the result is separation. Sometimes separation is necessary. It doesn't mean that if you could just sit down and just figure it out that it will all be better. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes there are circumstances which require you to experience separation. And some of you have experienced this even in the most difficult of circumstances with family. Or maybe you find yourself in situations where the disagreement is so strong that there has to be distance placed between you. And that's such a hard decision to make. In verse 39, it says, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark, because Barnabas drew a line in the sand. He's like, I'm taking Mark with me. He's my cousin. I like him. And I'm giving him a second chance. And they sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Barnabas takes Mark to Cyprus. Paul takes Silas through Syria. And I think it's important to recognize that even in the midst of our humanity and in the midst of our disagreements, and sometimes even in the midst of our sin, God's mission doesn't stop. It never stops. So a couple of things come to mind, and I'm going to close this out with this in this story. There's nothing that indicates that the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas were doctrinal issues. This wasn't a salvation issue. In both cases, Paul's disagreement with Barnabas and his problem with John Mark were dealing with personalities and the way that personal attitudes can translate into behavioral ministry. See, I think Barnabas, and this is my perception of this, and looking at the commentaries and looking at the original text, Team Barnabas is saying, Paul, how you talk to people and treat people, it's not good. That it's affecting the ministry. Your behaviors are affecting the ministry. And then you've got Team Paul over here saying, yeah, but you are so compromising because you care about what people think, and you think about like the people over the mission, that if you're not careful, you're going to compromise the mission. And there was indication that maybe Barnabas was at one point listening to the words of the Jews who were saying you had to be circumcised, and wondering maybe there's something to that. And Paul's over here saying, listen, I know that I sound angry and I know that I'm upset, but you just got to know how important this is. And he was right. But I would contend that in ministry today, it is possible to be right and to be wrong at the same time. Those who side with Team Barnabas tend to be a little bit more sensitive to the feelings of other people, often believe the best in other people because they believe that people can change and that change is coming. But I believe that more important than being right is doing right. But you will have those who are on Team Paul who, they're often of the same personality and temperament, and there are moments where my personality and temperament are a lot like Paul's, but I think being married to my wife and through the grace of God and his continual transformation and sanctification in my life, I'm a little leaning towards Barnabas. Thank you, God, for that. Nothing indicates in this whole scenario that it was necessarily a sin issue, but it was how they were responding to the people. Your point may be right, but how you're making the point cannot be or is not covered by the fruit of the Spirit. And that's really the point that I want to make this morning. Is that Paul was absolutely right, and he 100% should have brought correction into that situation. But I do wonder if Paul was still being sanctified from his conversion and lacking a bit of the fruit of the Spirit, of love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness and self-control. There was still an edge to him that God was continually dealing with in his life. I don't know if this is the case because we don't really know what the thorn in his flesh is, but I do wonder if maybe this is what he was talking about. And God, I just keep doing the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. And it was almost as if he was just saying, I don't know how to change that part of me. I don't know how to just not be so caustic and in your face about correction and about instruction. So what can we learn from this disagreement? One is, if a disagreement occurs, it's really important that we not assassinate the other person's character or the other person. Don't kill them. And in order to not assassinate another person's character, it begs the question, am I right with God? Where's my heart at? I will, full disclosure, tell you that I've been in circumstances and situations where there's been confrontation or there's been conflict with staff and ministry, different times in my previous church with our lead pastor even, and there's these moments where I've been guilty of this. Not maybe an assassination of character, but certainly of speaking ill about someone's decision. So the question is, am I right with God? Because if we're not, our minds will be clouded with, emotions. And our emotions will take over and we'll begin to defend ourselves. And that can be very dangerous. If you don't get your way in a disagreement, this is the second thing we can learn is don't stop doing God's will. And be careful to not talk too much. The third thing is sometimes separation is the right solution. It may not be a doctrinal problem, it may be a philosophical problem. We've had times in the life of our church in the 16 and a half years that we've been here, or 16 years that we've been here, where we've had staff members who philosophically disagree in how we lead and how we minister and the direction that the church is going. And there are moments where at that point, if there's that much of a disagreement where we can't agree to disagree, that philosophically we believe it should go this way and we believe it should go this way, separation is the right solution. However, I would recommend counsel in that. Don't make those decisions in a vacuum, in isolation. Find trusted leaders and spiritual advisors in your life to help you in making that decision. I don't want any of you leaving this place having had some disagreements in relationships and saying, I just heard today from my pastor that separation's the right move, so I'm out. I'm done with you. Seek counsel. Ask people who maybe are further along in their faith. The next thing that we can learn from this is that we are to guard our heart and we are to do our part. Have I admitted my fault? Have I asked for forgiveness? Have I been defensive towards the situation? Could I put myself in their shoes and maybe see it from a different perspective? Disagreement is not the end of ministry or of God doing something good. And the question is but am I willing to forgive? Because here's what I know about disagreement, especially in ministry, but I would argue that even in the context of any relational disagreement or dysfunction where forgiveness is necessary, if there is not forgiveness, it will lead to destruction. Time and time again, there are moments where I will be in conversation with people where it's clear that there is unforgiveness in their life, and it is affecting not just that relationship, it is affecting every aspect of their life. Where there is unforgiveness, there is problems. And forgiveness and unforgiveness, those are two very, very difficult subjects to teach on, because people find themselves in very different circumstances and situations. Recently, I went through a relational challenge that required forgiveness. I didn't want to forgive. I just didn't want to. I didn't even receive communion because I'm like, I know my heart hasn't forgiven. And I had people call me out on that and say, why aren't you receiving communion? I'm like, because I got unforgiveness in my heart, and I value communion way more than I value communion immensely, and I'm not going to compromise that based upon my unforgiveness. I've since come to a place of forgiveness, just FYI, in case you're concerned. But it's hard. And up to this relational disagreement and frustration, I had no problem with forgiveness. Just stuff kind of went off my back, and I just was able to forgive pretty quickly and easily. My wife struggled a little bit more with forgiveness in her life, and for me, I'm like, just forgive them, it's fine. And then this thing hit, and she's like, just forgive them, it's fine. It's hard. We make light of it, but it's hard. It's hard to find forgiveness. It's hard to find forgiveness for an abusive family member. It's hard to find forgiveness in your life for those who have betrayed you and turned your back on you. It's hard. And yet we're constantly reminded of what Jesus did on the cross. And we look at it in the context of the big picture of the gospel. And we look at our own life and we say, God, if you could forgive me, I could forgive them. Like, it doesn't mean you have to be in a relationship, because separation's probably the right move in some cases. But it does mean you have to bring your heart to a place of forgiveness. And when you do, when you forgive, it doesn't mean you forget the situation. But when you forgive, you truly say, God, this is in your hands. I trust you in that situation. I have no ill will towards them. I recognize that your grace and your forgiveness is present and evident in my life, and therefore the least I can do is extend forgiveness to others. When you do that, there's this weight that's lifted. And all of a sudden, you start seeing things clearer. And now all of a sudden, that mess of unforgiveness that was in your life, that was clouding every aspect of your life, is now gone. We want justice. We want people to be punished, don't we? Paul wanted John Mark to be punished. It's like, no, he didn't get to go with us. And that's our heart at times too. And I'm just wondering if maybe we'd be a little bit more like Team Barnabas, that says, we're going to give you a second chance. But we also stay true to Team Paul, that says, we're not going to compromise our faith. We're not going to compromise the message of Jesus and the gospel, but we're going to do it in a way that's loving and gracious. So what team are you on this morning? Team Paul? Team Barnabas? What if they're both right and both just a little bit wrong? I appreciate that Luke doesn't give us a clear winner in this story, because I like the human side. I like the tension. Because I find myself in that tension and that position a lot. Maybe you do too. So as you're thinking about your relational frustrations and dynamics, maybe you think about Team Barnabas and how you respond to people and the words that you use. But you never lose sight of Team Paul, that stays true to the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's pray.